The crack in the granite is no wider than a man's shoulders, and it goes straight back into the mountain's dark heart. Owen Hart, age 7, presses his ear against the stone and says he hears water. His mother thinks he is imagining things. His father is already reaching for the lantern. 3 years earlier, when Silas Hart filed the claim at Granite Pass, the land agent had squinted at the survey and said, "Son, there is nothing there but rock and wind." He was not wrong. He was only wrong about what that meant. Every impossible thing in the territory had been made possible by someone willing to look at the same ground twice. The Harts were about to look twice. The cabin sat on a shelf of land between 2 granite ridges, 40 miles from the nearest town of consequence, and the wind that came through Granite Pass in the autumn of 1887 was the kind that found every gap in the chinking and made the lard pail rattle on its hook all night. Silas Hart had built the cabin himself in the summer of 1884 using lodgepole pine he'd dragged 3 miles on a borrowed mule. It was square and solid and cold in a way that no amount of firewood entirely fixed. Mae Hart had come to Montana from Missouri 2 years after the cabin went up, arriving on the stage with a trunk, a seed tin, and a composed expression that Silas later admitted had unnerved him considerably. She was 23 then. She looked at the shelf of land and the 2 ridges and the small square cabin and said, "It will do." She did not say it unkindly. By the autumn of 1887, the cabin had a second window, a proper hearth, and Owen, who was 7 years old and given to finding things. He found a bird's nest in the woodpile each spring. He found a coin in the creek bed that turned out to be a Spanish reel. He found frogs under flat rocks and odd-shaped pieces of quartz that he kept in a row on the sill. Silas said the boy had a diviner's eye. Mae said he was simply patient in a way most people were not. The soil on the shelf was thin and stubborn. Silas grew oats and kitchen vegetables, but the oat yield was poor most years, and the kitchen garden required hauling creek water 50 yards uphill through the summer. There was a small income from trapping and from selling cured hides to the trading post at Granite Pass, but it was a narrow living, and they both knew it. The nearest neighbor was the Pruitt family, 2 miles south, who grew wheat on better ground and were not shy about mentioning it. Life was not hard in the breaking kind of way. It was hard in the wearing kind of way, which is sometimes worse. The crack appeared in the east-facing granite wall the autumn Owen turned 7, though Silas believed it had always been there, and they had simply stopped seeing it, the way you stop seeing a fence post you walk past every day. Owen found it on a Saturday in October, pressing his palm flat against the stone and declaring it warm. Silas came over and pressed his own hand to the rock face. The stone was cool, but the air coming from the crack was not. It was faint and damp and carried something mineral, the way a creek smells before you can see it. Silas put his face to the gap and breathed it in. "Mae," he said without turning around, "you can come here and tell me what you smell." Mae wiped her hands on her apron and came to stand beside him. She bent toward the crack and breathed. She straightened up again and looked at the gap with the exact expression she wore when she was working out a problem she did not yet have all the pieces to. "Water," she said. "Warm water." The crack ran vertically from about knee-height to well above Silas's head, perhaps 7 feet tall in its tallest reach. The width of it was irregular, wider at the middle than the top or bottom. Silas slid his arm into the shoulder and felt nothing but cool stone on the near side and warmer air beyond. He could not reach the far wall. "Could be a cavity," he said. "Could be quite small." Could be quite large, Mae said. Owen was already trying to squeeze himself in. Owen, Mae said, and he stopped, and they stood there for a time. Silas was thinking about the effort involved and what it might come to nothing, and Mae was thinking about something else entirely, though she did not say what yet. The wind came through the pass and pushed at their backs. It could be a danger, Silas said. Bad air, a drop-off. Could be, Mae said. Probably nothing. Probably, she agreed. But neither of them moved away. There was a practical argument against going in. They had wood to split and a harness to mend, and a half-finished letter to Mae's mother in Missouri that had been sitting on the table for a week. A gap in a rock face was not a task on any list. Silas was a man who worked from lists. And yet the warmth of that air against his face in the middle of an October morning, the smell of it, and something living and mineral and entirely out of place in that granite wall, had lodged in him the way Owen's frogs lodged in the boy's pockets. He could not put it down. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll trim the lantern wick and we'll have a look. If it's nothing, it's nothing. If it's nothing, it's nothing," Mae agreed. And Owen looked at both of them with the composed expression of a boy who had already decided it was not nothing. Silas trimmed the wick that evening and cleaned the lantern glass until it threw a clean circle of light. He said nothing about the crack at supper. Mae said nothing either, but she packed a length of rope in the morning, and when Silas saw it coiled on the bench by the door, he did not ask why. They went to the crack after the morning chores, the three of them, in the lantern lit and the rope over Silas's shoulder. Silas went first with the lantern, Owen close behind because nothing short of a direct order would have held him back. The stone received them. 2 weeks after they first entered the crack, Silas rode down to the Pruitt place on a Wednesday to return a borrowed auger. Hank Pruitt was at the fence line mending wire and asked how the shelf land was holding up for winter. "Well enough," Silas said, and nothing more. He did not mention the crack. He did not mention what they had found inside it. He rode home thinking about why he had said nothing, and decided it was not dishonesty. Some things needed to be understood by the people who lived them before they were spoken aloud to anyone else. The passage ran 40 feet, exactly. Silas paced it twice, shoulders turned sideways. Lantern held before him, the stone pressing cool against his chest and back. For the first 20 feet, it was tight, and he moved slowly, testing each step for solid footing and keeping his breathing measured. Owen had gone ahead without hesitation, the lantern light barely reaching him, before he disappeared around a slight leftward bend in the stone. Then the passage opened, not all at once, and not dramatically. The walls simply stepped back, first to arm's width, then to the width of a doorframe. Then, as Silas came around the bend and Mae pressed in behind him, to a space that stopped them both in their tracks. They stood at the edge of a stone basin, perhaps 30 feet across at its widest, and somewhere between 15 and 20 feet high at the apex of the ceiling, which was not entirely ceiling at all, but a series of fractured granite slabs laid against each other at angles that filtered the outside light through a dozen narrow fissures. The light that came down was indirect and thin, but real, and it caught the moisture in the air so that the whole space had a faint luminosity that was nothing like lantern light and nothing like daylight either. It was something between. Owen was standing in the middle of the basin, arms out, head back, looking up at the fissured ceiling with an expression that Silas had never seen on a child's face before and would spend years trying to describe to people who hadn't been there. The seep was along the eastern wall, a stretch of stone perhaps 8 feet long, where water wept steadily from a horizontal crack and ran in a thin, bright ribbon down to a natural stone lip, and then into a basin perhaps 2 feet across and 6 inches deep before finding its way through a lower crack in the floor. The water was clear. When Silas put his fingers in it, it was warm, not hot, but warm as creek water in midsummer, and it was October. He looked at Mae. Mae looked at him. She knelt and cupped water in her hands and tasted it. She tilted her head in that considering way. "Iron," she said, "and something else. Not bad, just strong." Silas tasted it. She was right. The floor of the basin was uneven granite with several shallow depressions and one long flat stretch that might, with work, accommodate a pair of bedrolls comfortably. Along the northern wall, the rock had been worked at by water and time into a series of deep ledges, natural shelves between 18 inches and 3 feet deep, each one roughly level. The air was mild, not the warmth of a fire, but the steady ambient warmth of deep stone that has been seeping heat for longer than anyone could reckon. Silas stood still and let himself feel it. After 3 years of cold nights on the shelf above, the warmth felt almost unearned. Owen had found a patch of green along the base of the eastern wall near the seep, a low mat of some small-leafed plant that had no business surviving this far from sunlight, fed by the mineral water and the heat rising from the stone. He was crouching over it, poking it gently with one finger. "It's alive," he said. "It's growing." "Some things," Mae said, "find a way." They stayed an hour that first morning. Silas walked the perimeter twice with the lantern, measuring in paces, pressing his hands to the walls, looking up at the fissured light. Mae sat on the long, flat stretch of floor and was quiet in a way she rarely was outside, where there was always wind. Owen collected 3 small white pebbles from the basin floor and put them in his pocket. When they came out, blinking, into the gray October morning, the wind had picked up and the temperature had dropped another degree. Silas turned and looked at the crack in the granite with new eyes. "It's ours," he said, not as a claim, more as a recognition. The work began on a Monday, because Silas Hart was not a man to let wonder sit idle when there was still good daylight and a solid back. The first task was air. He spent 2 days outside on the upper granite face, with a cold chisel and a hammer, following the line of fissures with his hands until he found 2 that could be widened without compromising the stone above. He worked carefully, a 1/4 inch at a time, checking below between each strike, where Mae stood in the basin with the lantern watching the ceiling. The light that came through after the second day's work was a clean column, thin as a handspan, falling straight to the basin floor in a bright rod that moved across the stone as the sun moved overhead. Owen stood in it and said it felt like standing in a warm room with a window open. Mae addressed the seep wall. She spent 3 mornings with a tin cup and a flat stone, redirecting the water's path along the stone lip and building up a small levee of river clay she'd hauled in a bucket through the passage. By the 3rd day, she had the water running in a controlled channel along the eastern wall, pooling in the natural basin rather than losing itself immediately to the lower crack. The pool was never more than 8 inches deep, but it held, and it was warm, and it was clean enough for washing. For the natural shelves along the northern wall, Silas built frames from pine he'd cut weeks earlier and finished drying in the cabin rafters, then carried through the passage in sections short enough to manage the bend. Mae notched the frames to sit level on the uneven stone, and they lined 3 shelves with split pine planks. The result was rough but solid, and by the end of October, they had root vegetables, dried herbs, 2 crocks of preserved beans, and a small tin of rendered lard stored in the cool lower shelf, and the cabin's full winter supply of dried meat on the upper shelf, out of the weather for the first time since they'd built the place. The sleeping nook was Silas's idea and Mae's execution. Against the western curve of the basin wall, where the warmth of the stone was most constant, they built a platform of planks on low pine legs to keep the bedding off the stone. Mae stitched a curtain of heavy wool from a blanket she'd worn threadbare on one side and hung it on a rod of bent wire so that the nook was curtained off from the rest of the basin. She put their second set of bedding in it, the good quilts her mother had sent from Missouri, and a folded sheepskin for Owen. The first night they slept inside the basin, Owen fell asleep before Silas had finished trimming the lantern. Mae lay on her side in the dark, listening to the sound of the seep, which was a very small sound, continuous and even, and said quietly that it sounded like rain without any of the trouble rain usually brought. Silas said that was about right. The kitchen shelf was the last piece. Mae did not want to cook inside the basin. The smoke would collect in the fissures and cause problems. But she built a preparation shelf in the first widened section of the passage where it was broad enough to stand in, a plank shelf at working height where she could sort and cut and prepare before carrying things out to the cooking fire. She hung 2 hooks on the stone above it for her knife and a cloth towel. She put a small clay crock of salt in the corner. One morning in early November, Owen ate his breakfast porridge sitting cross-legged on the basin floor, watching the column of light move across the stone above him. He had been counting the white pebbles in his collection, which now numbered 11. "Papa," he said, "do you think anybody else in the whole territory has a place like this?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "I don't believe they do." On the 15th of November, Hank Pruitt rode up to the shelf with his eldest son to return a saw Silas had lent in September. He found Silas working at the granite face with a chisel and asked what on earth he was doing. Silas looked at the crack, then at Hank, then made a decision. "Come and see," he said. Hank Pruitt was a practical man who did not give compliments easily or often. He stood in the basin for 4 minutes without saying a word. Then he said, "Lord Almighty, Silas." That was the moment Silas understood that what they had was not just remarkable to themselves. Word moved through a valley the way water moves, finding its own level and getting into places you would not expect. By December, 3 families knew about the hidden basin, and by January, 2 more. Most came by invitation on Silas's terms, an afternoon visit where he brought them through the passage and showed them the seep and the shelves and the column of light, and they stood in the basin and breathed the mild air and looked at Mae's curtained sleeping nook and went home with something changed in their expressions. Not everyone came away convinced that the change was good. Jeremiah Croft ranched 6 miles north of the pass and was the closest thing Granite Pass had to a voice of authority, not by any official position, but by length of tenure in the valley and by the volume at which he expressed opinions. He had arrived in the territory in 1871, which was 16 years ago, and he spoke about those 16 years the way some men speak about a military campaign. He had opinions about land use and proper settlement practice, and when word of the Hart Basin reached him through his wife, who had heard it from the Pruitts, his first reaction was skepticism, and his second was something less agreeable. He rode to the shelf in January on a cold, clear afternoon, and Silas showed him the crack and offered to take him through. Croft looked at the crack for a long moment. "That's a mine entry," he said. "You file a mineral claim?" "It's not a mine," Silas said. "There's no ore. It's a natural basin. You drawing water from it?" "For the household. It's our land." "Your cabin claim is on the shelf above," Croft said. "The rock face is a separate matter. You file on the rock face?" Silas had not filed on the rock face. His cabin claim covered the shelf and the acreage surrounding it, but he had not specifically included the granite formation in the filing. It had not occurred to him. The crack was in the rock that bordered his claim on the east. Whether it fell within the claim boundaries, or at the edge of them, or technically outside them, was a question he had not asked, because he had not known there was an answer needed. Croft knew that. Silas could see that he knew it. "I'm just asking questions," Croft said. "Man has a right to ask questions." He rode back down without asking to see the inside. The following week, Silas rode to Granite Pass and found the land agent, a young man named Carroll who wore a city coat and kept meticulous files. Silas asked to see the boundary records for his claim. Carroll pulled the file. At first glance, the eastern boundary of the Hart claim appeared to run along the base of the granite formation, which would have meant the face itself, and everything behind it, lay outside the formal claim. Silas sat with that for a moment. What would it take, he said carefully, to amend the claim to include the rock face? Carroll explained the amendment process. It required a survey notation and a filing fee, and, if the acreage involved was under 5 acres, it could be handled locally without referral to the district land office. Carroll estimated the basin at somewhere between 1/4 acre and 1 acre based on Silas's description. That was well within local jurisdiction. "How long?" Silas asked. 6 weeks minimum, Carroll said, "if there are no competing claims filed in the interval." Silas rode home in the dark, which he did not like to do, thinking about the phrase competing claims and what Croft had understood about the gap in his paperwork and whether understanding was the same as intention. The competing claim arrived at Carroll's office on the 4th of February, filed by one Jeremiah Croft, citing the rock formation along the eastern boundary of the Hart Shelf claim as prospectively mineral-bearing ground and applying for a preliminary mineral survey under the mining laws. Carroll sent word to Silas by way of the Pruitt boy, who made the ride in 2 hours and arrived cold and apologetic, as though he were responsible for the news. Silas thanked him, fed him a bowl of stew, and sent him back with a reply that he would come to town by the end of the week. Mae heard the details that evening after Owen was asleep in the basin's sleeping nook, where he had taken to spending most nights. She sat at the cabin table with her hands folded and listened to all of it. "He has no mineral claim," she said. There's no ore." "He has a preliminary survey application," Silas said. "The application creates standing. The survey would determine whether there's basis for the claim. If the surveyor says no mineral content, the claim fails. But while the survey is pending, any improvements we make to the rock face could be contested as encroachments on claimed land." Mae was quiet for a moment. "So we stop work," she said, "for now. And if the surveyor finds no mineral content, which he will because there is none, then the claim fails and we proceed with the amendment. And if Croft finds another angle in the interval?" Silas had no answer for that, because it was the question he had been sitting with since the Pruitt boy had handed him the note, and there was something about the basin that had gotten under Croft's skin in a way that went past the land question. Silas had seen it in the man's eyes when he'd looked at the crack and declined to go in. Croft was not a man who liked being surprised by the ground he'd thought he understood. He had spent 16 years forming opinions about what this valley would and would not yield, and a warm, hidden basin with mineral water, and a family sleeping comfortably through a Montana winter was not consistent with those opinions. It rattled something in him, and rattled men were unpredictable. The second piece of news came from Mae's own observation, which she had been sitting on for several days and now decided Silas needed to know. The small leafed plant along the seep wall had spread. When she measured in January, and it covered perhaps 4 square feet. By the first week of February, it covered nearly 8. It had crept toward the column of light that Silas had widened in the fissures above, and the growth closest to the light was greener and more robust than the rest. She had brought in a seed tin in October with kitchen herb seeds she'd been planning to start in the cabin window, and on an impulse she had pressed several seeds into the damp clay along the seep wall. She had been checking them quietly and had told no one. Every seed had sprouted. She showed Silas in the morning, crouching by the eastern wall with the lantern, pointing to the small upright shoots, 6 of them, all green, all alive. And in the first week of February, when the ground outside was frozen 8 inches down and the temperature at night had not risen above 12 degrees in a month. Silas crouched beside her and looked at the shoots for a long time. "Don't tell anyone about these," he said finally. "I hadn't planned to," Mae said. The preliminary survey was scheduled for the 5th of March. Carol sent word that the territorial surveyor, a man named Aldous Beck, would make the examination and submit his findings within 30 days of the visit. Until Beck's report was filed, the amendment process was suspended. Silas went to the basin that evening alone, after supper, and sat in the dark with the lantern unlit for a while. He could hear the seep. He could feel the warmth of the stone around him. He thought about filing claims and survey schedules and the particular cruelty of being shown something extraordinary and then told to wait and see if it was allowed. He sat there long enough for the cold of the stone floor to work through his trousers, and then he lit the lantern and looked around the basin in the low gold light. Mae's curtain hung straight in the still air. Owen's 3 original white pebbles sat on the edge of the sleeping platform where he had left them the morning he'd moved his collection to a proper shelf. The herb shoots along the seep wall were invisible from here, but Silas knew where they were. He knew where every worked edge and fitted plank and redirected channel of water was in this space, because he had helped make each one. That was the thing about a place you had made. It was not possible to be indifferent to it in the way you could be indifferent to a piece of land you had only stood on. The making was inside you. Every notch in a pine frame and every bucket of clay hauled through the passage was part of the reckoning now. And losing it would not be losing a location. It would be losing the thing the location had allowed them to become. He was not a man who prayed formally. But he sat in the warm dark of the basin and asked, plainly, for the right outcome. And then he got up and went back through the passage to make breakfast, because the morning still required it. Mae was already up when he came into the cabin, standing at the table with the claim file and the original survey map, which she had asked Carol to copy for her in January without telling Silas why. "Sit down," she said. "I want to show you something." She had been measuring, not the basin alone, but the relationship between the basin's position in the rock and the surface boundary markers of the original claim. She had done the arithmetic 3 times. "The basin," she said, "is inside our boundary." Silas looked at the map and the numbers Mae had written on the side of it in her even unhurried hand. She walked him through the calculation twice, slowly, pointing to each reference point in turn. The original Hart claim boundary on the east ran along the base of the granite formation. That much Carol had first inferred. But the basin was not behind the formation. It was inside it. The granite ridge itself was part of the claim. The passage that led to the basin ran horizontally into the ridge, not past it. And the ridge, measured from the surface boundary markers that Silas had set himself 3 years ago, fell within the claim on all sides. "The crack opens into the face," Mae said. The basin is inside the rock that sits on our land. Croft filed on the rock face, Silas said. He filed on a mineral survey of ground he described as adjacent to your eastern boundary, Mae said. Not inside it. If the basin is inside the ridge, and the ridge is inside the claim, then there's no adjacent ground to survey. Silas looked at the numbers again. He was not a surveyor, but he was a man who had set those boundary markers himself and knew the ground between them in the way you know ground you have crossed on foot in every season. The eastern marker was a flat granite stone he had placed at the corner of the formation, not at its base. At its corner, which meant the formation itself was inside the marker. He rode to Carol's office the next morning with Mae's map and her calculations and laid them on the desk. Carol studied them for a long time, turning the map and returning to the numbers. He was a methodical man, which was what you wanted in a land agent, and he did not speak until he had worked through the arithmetic himself on a separate sheet. If this measurement is accurate, Carol said finally, the eastern boundary marker encompasses the granite formation, which would place the interior cavity within the existing claim. There would be no basis for an adjacent mineral survey because the ground is not adjacent, it's interior. Is the measurement accurate? Silas asked. I'd need to verify in the field, Carol said. But the marker locations are on record and the numbers align with the recorded survey. I believe it's accurate. Aldous Beck, the territorial surveyor, rode out to Granite Pass on the 5th of March as scheduled, accompanied by Carol and by Silas, and without Jeremiah Croft, who had not been invited and who arrived at the claim boundary to find all three of them already at work with measuring chains. Beck was a weathered man of few words who had been conducting land surveys in Montana Territory for 11 years and who appeared entirely unbothered by the circumstances. He set his chains, read his instruments, and recorded his measurements in a notebook that he did not show to anyone. He asked to see the formation. Silas walked him to the crack. Beck looked at the crack, then at his notebook, then back at the crack. This goes in? He asked. 40 feet, Silas said. Beck looked at Croft, who was standing 20 yards back at the boundary, watching. The formation from corner marker to corner marker, Beck said, confirming his own notation rather than asking, is entirely within the filed boundaries of the Hart Homestead claim. He wrote something in his notebook. There is no ground exterior to that claim available for a mineral survey, as described in the Croft application. The application is without basis. He closed the notebook. Croft said nothing. He stood at the boundary for another minute, then turned his horse and rode back down the valley without a word. Carol filed the formal finding the following week, and Silas's amendment, adding the geological formation to the explicit language of the claim, was approved within 30 days. The document came back with a land office seal and Carol's signature at the bottom. Silas brought it home and put it on the table, and Owen traced the seal with his finger and asked what it meant. It means this is ours, Silas told him. It was always ours, Owen said. Yes, Silas said, but now the paper agrees. The spring of 1888 was the best season the Hart place had seen in 4 years. The herb garden along the seep wall had expanded to cover nearly 15 feet of the eastern wall by May, and May had added onion starts, a trial row of small radishes, and 3 tomato plants she had grown as seedlings in the cabin window before transferring them to the warmth of the basin in April. The tomatoes were small and slow, but by July, 2 of the 3 were bearing fruit, which was not something May had ever managed on the shelf above, though where the growing season was short and the nights cold even in midsummer. Silas widened the upper fissures another hand's width in April, using better technique than he had the first time, and the column of light was now broad enough that it split into two distinct pillars in the afternoon, and the basin had a quality of illumination that visitors routinely stopped and remarked upon. The Pruitt family came in May with their 4 children, and the Alderson family from the north end of the valley came in June, and after each visit the same thing happened, which was that the visitors stood in the basin in the mild air and the angled light and said some version of the same thing, which was that they would not have believed it if they hadn't seen it. Hank Pruitt, on his second visit, stood at the seep wall looking at the tomato plants and shook his head slowly. "You know what this valley has been saying about your ground for 10 years, Silas," he said. "I know what it's been saying," Silas said. "Well," Hank said, looking at the tomatoes, "it was wrong." Mae was at the preparation shelf in the passage, working through a crock of dried beans, and when she heard that, she smiled to herself in the way she smiled when she had known a thing for a while and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. On a warm evening in July, Owen Hart sits at the edge of the stone pool with his collection of white pebbles arranged in a row beside him, counting the tomatoes on the vine. The column of light from above has shifted to gold. The seep runs its quiet, continuous note. Silas is at the plank shelf in the passage, sharpening a tool. Mae is somewhere above, singing to herself on the shelf in the last hour of daylight. Owen listens to all of it, his father's steady rasp, his mother's voice, the water. He adds one more pebble to the row. The stone is warm. Everything just now is exactly enough.